Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest in the series of digital events that IDEX Legal have been putting together for the community over the last few weeks. Obviously, during the lockdown phase, our business of large gatherings, isn't the right thing to be doing right now. Won't be for a while. So what we've kind of curated in the meantime for the community, is how do we have interesting conversations, bringing the legal fraternity, whether it's lawyers, whether it's in-house and beyond, to come together and still be having relevant conversations. And I'm really excited to be hosting this one. It's something actually we've been working on in the Navneet for since pretty much Christmas. We were ideating how do we have this conversation about GC beyond the law, and it's really about. Navneet will go into much more detail himself and with the panel, but it was really looking at that void within society at the moment, where, and Navneet will talk about research showing there's this kind of void where people are looking and employees are looking for guidance for an ethical stance, morality, etc. And we just don't know where to look anymore. I mean, you're not going to look to government. At times it's now tough to look to the judiciary in different countries, and so there's kind of a move for employees to really look at the employer, and their bosses and their teammates and colleagues as a kind of, okay, this is the social and ethical compass for us as society. And we were originally planning to do this last month at the Legal Counsel Congress, which obviously we didn't. And I thought, well, let's just do it anyway, because it's an important conversation. And we all know that the role of legal and in-house has changed rapidly in the last decade. And to even be having this conversation, I think is, it's something we wouldn't have mentioned a few years ago, that, can the in-house community, in-house counsel team, really challenge to become the voice for social change within the business, within society. Alongside Navneet, Navneet, I think we all know well, he's the executive director, legal and head of APAC for Cisco Systems. He originally became a lawyer to avoid the sciences, and as he ironically says, he's now built a career providing advice to tech companies around the globe. We've also got Lakshminarayan joining us. She's the AVP Legal and Lead IP Counsel globally for Altran. She's also part of the leadership team there. We're also lucky to have Lakshminarayan, who's the Chief Endowment Officer of Azim Premji Foundation, and also well known as LAN to his community. We've also got Sachin Malhan, who's the co-founder of Agami, which is an initiative catalyzing innovation and entrepreneurship and collaboration between law and justice. And the topic they're going to be discussing today is reimagining in-house legal departments and how, so that's next week. Today's one is very much about focusing on GC beyond the law. How can in-house counsels be a voice for social change? And I'm now going to hand it over to Navneet to take over and drive the conversation.
Thank you, Vikas. As I always said, in many respects, you are ahead of your time. And I think today you were actually 1 week ahead. But thank you for the kind introduction. Like Vikas said, I think this has been a conversation, a topic that we have been seeing come up time and again, particularly in a corporate situation. And it's kind of interesting in many respects because, having grown up in India and being the son of a government officer, I think commercial work was never looked upon as being something that was we should aim for, right? And it was always looked down upon to a certain extent. And working in a company was, the boxwala concept used to be there. And similarly, in law school, it was very much anti-capitalism, shall I say, right? So to a certain extent, it's kind of interesting to walk the whole circle back and talk about the role of companies and how it's changing. And we see that happen a fair bit across the board. So there are two parts I want to quickly touch on from an introduction perspective. The next slide, please, Warka. And what we were going to talk about was basically the change in how the companies work, right? And as the other slide is coming up, the role really, if you look back, the main aim of a company often used to be to try and maximize profit, right? So shareholder value is what companies are supposed to focus on. And in many respects, when you look at the concept of fiduciary duty, which most us lawyers have to deal with, you will probably see that happen a fair bit, right? And to a certain extent, trying to maximize shareholder returns is actually what is your duty, right, in a sense. That has often led to certain situations. If I could have the next slide, Barka. Here we see a couple of pictures, right? And the first picture is from, it's actually the early 1900s. The picture is of a machine called the Hollerith machine. Now, for those of us who are, a bit of a history buff like I am, right? It's a very interesting piece of technology. It was high technology at that time, right? And it doesn't look like much right now. It looks like something your grandfather probably had in his attic. But this machine is what you actually use to tabulate census data, right? So whenever the countries like the US or many others in Europe would try to conduct a census, this machine was critical. This is a machine owned by IBM, right? And it was licensed by them, was provided by them, was maintained by them. There was an allegation in the early 2000s by a gentleman called Edwin Black that this machine had been supplied and maintained and run by IBM in Nazi Germany in 1930, right? To a certain extent, the census conversation resonates with us in India with all the discussions about NRC and NPR. COVID has taken over most of that, so you don't even hear about it now anymore. Just goes to show you how fast things change. But the allegation was that the IBM basically supported the use of these machines in Germany, and the census that was conducted later in other countries which were invaded by the Nazis the data was used to differentiate and to figure out which are the populations they wanted to target, right? If you can just look at it from today's perspective, that is almost, anathema to an organization, right? And if you look at history, you see a lot of other companies, Volkswagen or many other well-known names, right, which were supposed to have taken part in stuff, which today we would look upon and probably frown on, or step back in horror, right? But that was the early 1900s. It went on till the 80s. I mean, many of us know, or at least those of us who are old enough like me, remember the Bhopal Gas Tragedy, right? The reality is, ever-ready batteries are still sold in India and we still buy them, right? So net, what you're looking at is a situation where the concept of shareholder value really overrides everything else. The company is supposed to do stuff to make good on its bottom line and not be worried about other consequences. Fast forward a bit though, and to the next picture, and you have a bunch of protesters standing outside bank in London, in the city of London, protesting against banks for having made investments in fossil fuel technology, right? Nothing to do with the bank's business. The bank is not the one going and digging up holes in the world and around the world, but it's funding it was the concern. And we are seeing this change happen a fair bit. There was a report by the Edelman Trust, which comes out every year, which talks about how the level of trust in companies is actually increasing. People have more trust in their employer and they expect their employers to do more as opposed to other more traditional models, right? So that's kind of the background to this, this whole talk and to look at it from an overall perspective. And so I would like to first call on Lan, our distinguished panelist. Lan and I go back a long way together. And so Lan, you have a background both in the corporate field. I worked for you when you were the CFO of Wipro. You are now in the foundation side. This is a huge change in perception, right?
It is.
Why is this happening? What's your perspective?
So I think this whole change in perspective to me comes from two things. One is the shift from a single point reference to multiple point reference in many aspects of our lives. So if you look back at, and you started the example of shareholder wealth maximization. So a business, the whole paradigm is shifting from a shareholder wealth maximization to a stakeholder wellness maximization. So you're looking at not just one shareholder, but you're looking at a range of people whom you work with. If you look at things like information, Information is shifting from a single source. Many of us grew up with either newspapers or later on televisions being the only source of information or the most credible source of information, to a situation where today we are bombarded with many things like Twitter, Facebook, the social media, the internet explode. And even there, if you look at it, a lot of its importance is given to who is it coming from. So your credibility of who sends you that matters in terms of whether you accept it or not. If you look at the way we are looking at solving society's problems, originally it was said that the welfare of the masses is the biggest response, the only response, or was the responsibility of only the government. Today, we have companies with their CSRs, civil society organizations, not-for-profits, individuals, all pitching in. And again, there's an element of proximity and and closeness, and that's adding credibility. And finally, if I were to sort of look back at a general level, we always felt that, we always accepted that there were multiple needs, and the paradigm was one of prioritization. So we said that there are 7-8 needs, let's prioritize one at a time, address them. Today we are moving to something which is, I think it is acceptance of plural needs, which means that you need to have multiple things, you've got to balance them out. And this has meant that you have multiple inputs coming to you, and the way people whom you trust have features such as people who can deal with this multiplicity and those who have proximity. I think that's where the whole changes come from in society, and that's one major source of why these issues come up.
That's great. Thank you, Lan. I mean, it's always very interesting to see the different perspectives coming here. And I think, Sachin, so if I could move to you next, right? How are you seeing this play out in your space?
Just building on what Lan was saying, I think there is a complexity that is growing, because you can't look at things as just single cause and effect. You've got so many different stakeholders, different forces. And I think that the way I look at it, a picture speaks 1,000 words. So I made a little kind of diagram that maybe I can share. I don't know, can you see that? Awesome. Yeah, so kind of, I look at it as 3 things that are intersecting. One is a framework that we know, ethics, the idea that, you must do right, but it comes from morals, and it has a certain history to it. It is always going to have a place, the ethical framework. There's a second part that is a very interesting concept, that is trust. And trust is something that is, kind of growing as its own force. And the third is purpose. And if you look at them, they actually come from, and as Lan said, these are not frameworks in isolation. They are frameworks that apply as much to individuals as they do to organizations, right? So the ethics part, is more of the responsibility, the how you must do something. The trust part is the who, because the who is changing. You can't just sell something to someone. Your vendors, your partners, your consumers are no longer just sort of receiving stuff that you're popping out. That is the changing nature of business. And the most critical, I think, is the why. The changing nature of self-actualization. Why do you do what you do? And that is purpose. So to me, if we have to really understand the fact that business faces a huge challenge, which then shows up now in the data, right? Like millennials prefer this. People are leaving these companies for these companies. The choices, those are just the results of these frameworks growing much faster than even the business gurus can articulate them. They become embodied in how people behave much faster than the management gurus frame them, right? So that's why, there's this beautiful, in the Accenture report that came out, which found trust to be the single biggest competitive advantage. They took a side shot at Michael Porter, because of the fact that Michael Porter was the guru of competitive advantage, and they took a little shot saying, this is clearly the biggest thing, trust. Purpose, as we know, is something if you don't have that clearly, then you're in trouble. I think I've heard Lakshika also articulate that previously. So I think what's really interesting is that little yellow space that you see in the middle. The yellow space you see in the middle is the space for new roles of leadership. And the last thing I'll say is, for me, the General Counsel, is a really interesting phenomena. Firstly, as far as I see in India, the role of the General Counsel is not completely clear. Different people, now you and Lakshika can correct if it's wrong, but people define it differently. Some people see it as a steward of sort of a public steward inside a private organization. Some people see it as a consigliere. Some people see it as a hustler who will defend at any cost. But essentially, I think what I've also heard data from, I remember Leah Cooper, who's a well-known consultant in the legal space, had mentioned this. She said that businesses want general counsels to focus on the growth and running part, not on protecting and defending of the companies all the time. Now, if you are saying that this role is about growing and running the organization, can you stay in the ethical circle, or you must consider what leadership in trust and purpose is about? And that throws up challenges, and we can talk about how people can respond to those challenges in terms of where innovation comes in. But I think it's important to first understand where to locate oneself before we look at what the challenges are. I'll stop there.
No, that's lovely, and I like to see the design thinking that you have brought into the whole approach, Sachin. That's a kind of pie diagram that's used a lot when people do even develop products, right? And I think the point about trust that you make is really critical. And since I work for Cisco and I'm on Zoom, I think I'm duty bound to make a snide remark here. I think you probably read about how Zoom went through all the issues they did about privacy, and I think they've gone about trying to fix that perception, right? And they have agreed to do certain things with end-to-end encryption, and they've brought in some people into the board. So obviously trust is important, right? Just having a good product is not sufficient to get you there. So that's well put. So Lakshika, let me turn to you, and I think the question really is twofold, right? So one I would ask you is building trust, right? Is that an important thing for the company and its reputation, right? And what role do you see lawyers and general counsels alike playing in that situation?
Thanks, Navneet. So yeah, I think we've sort of, in many ways, I've heard undertones of this already answered earlier. So, the question is, why do you think trust is important to be built, within an organization and also for an organization? So the simple answer to that is, I think I would equate trust to a very large extent to the brand itself, the credibility, the integrity, and the identification. The brand identification is directly proportional to the trust and the values that it stands for. And the more you keep asserting and reasserting those values and the purpose that Sachin mentioned, that the brand stands for or the company stands for, the more trust it builds in the community and in the society for that brand. Essentially, that also becomes a key distinguisher for businesses, because in today's world, there isn't any business which is entirely unique. Of course, there are cartels, there are monopolies, and so on. But beyond that, there are first movers, and then there is a whole plethora of, businesses that follow, or they even improvise, sometimes innovate better than the first movers. So how do you really then be up there, keep doing what you do to the best of its capability, and yet retain not only your customers, but your partners, your vendors, and your employees? So I think for everything, what is the key here is to be able to create a distinguishing brand. And when you're talking about a distinguishing brand, you would very automatically talk about a reputation around it. And the repetition is what is directly proportional to the trust that people have in the brand or in the company and in the organization, which comes then directly from the values, the purpose it stands for, and objectives, and so on and so forth. So I think, there is no question. This is something which is a key mandate for anyone to survive in the business ecosystem. That's my view on the trust factor. And then your other question was, how do you build it, which is also sort of answered in the first part. I think it's directly proportional to the values you stand for. continuous assertion, reassertion through actions. So, people don't want to hear about your values and policies. They want to see them. And this is very different, or I would say that Sachin mentioned something about millennials earlier. And I would say that not just millennials, but also probably Gen X like us are focusing a lot on really identifying if the organization is actually a believer of those values. And how do you validate that? By the actions of the organizations when you see it being rolled out. It's not just about a charter on the company website or rolling out policies, because that's just paperwork. And we all know that it's only as good as it is. And it has to be actually then visible and well seen through the actions of the organization. So the actions are that speak for themselves.
That's great. I mean, I think it's kind of nicely encapsulates me and pushes me to the next question for you, Lakshika. I think I'll stay with you for a while, which is how does a lawyer involve herself or himself here, right? And are there steps we can take as legal professionals? So I think probably break it up a bit. Legal professionals who are doing a day job, and then the more senior lawyers like yourself who deal with the board, right? What would be your advice for them?
So I think as lawyers, or as even for that matter as leaders, we play a very critical role in this trust building. And how and why we play this role is what I'm going to emphasize on. On a day-to-day basis, we come across, instances where we need to advise, where we need to opine, where we need to sort of work through the system. Now, at each point, if we were to consider that being a gateway to what is right and what is wrong, and at each of those checkpoints, if we were to question ourselves or reassert the values for which the brand stands or the purpose of the company, if we were to sort of keep validating that at each of those checkpoints, I think that's what we need to do to be able to then have the whole exercise of transitioning or seamlessly integrating those values within the DNA of the company. And as lawyers, because it ranges all the way from very simple vendor management related contracts to say procurement to security personnel that are sort of hired for taking care of the premises, to everything sort of goes through a legal department. And I think at each step, and not just that, there are things, people would just cross you in corridors and ask you a one-off question on something which probably may not sound directly related to the core business, but it resides somewhere in the ancillaries. But if not done correctly, it will have a huge impact on the entire brand building exercise that the company has stood for years and years. And therefore, at all times, you need to stand up for those values. You need to be able to. So unless I think the legal person handling work within the company imbibe those values themselves and are aligned with the purpose of the company, they wouldn't be able to channelize all of that into what goes on. More so as leaders, I think there is a lot of community inside and outside the organization that's looking up to us for how we look at challenges, how we sort of navigate through those challenges, how we move through difficult situations and wade our way through, waters. It could be situations like, COVID-19, which we are all sort of facing right now. And I think I strongly believe in that principle of leading by example. And unless you can do that, it's just, it's just a story that you're telling people with no meaning. They would probably just go back and forget about it. You need to live by it to be able to then, actually communicate what, and sometimes when you live by it, you don't really need a policy or a guideline or a bullet pointer to be rolled out to say, your teams or to people in the company, it just becomes so inherent in the way the culture is that, it happens very seamlessly, And this is with respect to our colleagues and our, people we work with, co-workers. It also is incumbent upon leaders to then shape what the organization's board is thinking, what the organization's board is sensitive towards, how you can steer their, mind frames, how you can bring certain things to their notice. Is there some sensitization that you can do at that level? Because most of these are best rolled out from the top, and that's just the way the stream flows. It's best when it comes from the top. Otherwise, some very very meaningful initiatives also never take off the ground because there is no interest from the board or from the people who actually should be running it.
And that's true. And I think if you look at it, I think there was the recent article about how I think it was British Telecom, right, who issued decided to empanel their lawyers again, and they said that you have to go through this process, and actually the one firm gets a free pass if they have increased diversity in there, right? So in their firm, the firm with the maximum amount of diversity in its ranks will actually get a step. Will get an easy pass, and I think that's such a good way to show, right, the values of the organization, and to say that, hey, this is critical to us and we want to make this happen, right? So great points, Lakshika. And I think I'll move away a little bit to the smaller side of the house, I think, Sachin, which is you deal with a lot of companies, some of them for-profit companies, some of them not for-profit. But are you really seeing this kind of trend come up there, where people working there feel a sense of purpose, or they want to see their employer do more, or is this just stuck at a certain level in industry?
I think that you can look at it in two ways. So one little point of context is that for about 6 years, between 2012 2018, I was in the US, and I was working with an organization that works with very large enterprises on their purpose strategies. It's an organization called Ashoka, as headquartered in DC, and they work with these organizations. And so I got a vantage point into how they look at this whole issue of purpose and trust, and how do they look at it? How do they architect their strategies? And in the last 2 to 3 years, I've been back in India, and I've been looking at it from the Indian context. So one thing that's common right across is millennial aspirations, and I would add to what Lakshika said, Gen X as well. There is a strong inclination to find your anchor, there's not much catching up. The aspirations are the same, right? People want to live an integrated life. They want a life where your work is not at odds with your values and those kind of things. But I think that there's a good and bad to the enterprise side. The good part is that if you look at the West, they've gone through the ultra capitalistic journey, and at some level, some are coming out on the other side of it. Where they're kind of reimagining their core thing. So like a company, whether it's an IKEA or something, would say, look, we're about play. And play is at our core story. That's our story. Our story is our strategy. And we're about play. We're not about social change or business or government. We're about play. And play is as a full concept. And that opens up opportunities. You don't create a schism, CSR, what's your social thingy? What's your business? You don't create a schism. So they're coming out on the other side and trying to think of what does it mean to look at it in an integrated way, because they see the opportunities there. I think that in India, there's a good and bad. The good is that in India, because it's relatively new, there is a tremendous latent leadership to want to do things differently and not to go with the playbook that has been given of how business must be. And there is a long legacy of doing business for services society. So there is that latent leadership. The challenge is that I have a feeling, and this is a controversial viewpoint, that the CSR mindset is actually a little bit of a albatross, where it is tremendous and powerful, but it's also holding us back from really evaluating how we want to create Indian business. And that, if that isn't squared away, If that is not deeply answered, then you will see all the issues of millennials saying, this doesn't sit with me. This doesn't, you can't tell me that you're making this product, which really, frankly, is not net positive to the world. And you're telling me you do good CSR. It just doesn't work. You have to tell me why I am a part of a story I care about. And the story has to be whole. That we are seeing again and again, the tensions. In the legal community, for instance, Nav, and you'll appreciate, a lot of people say, as long as we're good lawyers, we're doing our bit for society. I'm doing, and to me, sorry, that is not valid anymore. You can't commit it by creating that artificial division. So I have a feeling that we're still playing catch up. But the good part is because because the latent leadership is there, we can actually evolve models for what we do. And I want to be specific, which is at some point I'll come back to how people are using ethics, trust, and purpose to actually drive innovation. They're actually using it to say, it's not enough to just say our products are compliant, are purposeful, or whatever. It's also important to bring in the innovation. So people always think that this is a dynamic process. We care about these things and we're going to innovate in the direction of our core story. And we're going to do that for trust. We're going to do that for purpose. And that innovation keeps it dynamic, keeps it live. So that millennials are very interested in what's dynamic in life. They're not interested in the fixed story, it's done. And I subscribe to that. Who wants the same thing being told to you every day? You want a different thing, but you want it authentic,
That's great. I think it was our Cisco, at least our CEO talks about do good and you will do well, right? So I might come back to you in a bit, Sachin, to talk a bit about the connection that you're talking about, ethics and doing well, right? So I'll come back to you in a bit. But let me turn to Lan and ask a slightly controversial question, I think, right? Sachin mentioned the CSR play, right? And we have all these things coming out, right? Sometimes it's a criminal offense not to do it. Sometimes it is not a criminal offense, right? From an overall perspective, from a public policy perspective, right? Is the CSR thing a good requirement, or are there other areas that we should also be looking at from a public policy perspective?
Oops, that is a tough one. It's definitely controversial. So here's what. Okay? The way the CSR thing has rolled out in India, I think there are two aspects to it which are good. The first is the fact that it's made people, the point that Sachin made, that you need to have, just bring in the awareness that purpose, trust, all these are very important. You need to manage all your stakeholders. You need to do something for the society. India has got such amount of underprivilegedness that you need to be sort of concerned about it. So that it's brought in some certain amount of awareness of that. Two, because of this law, it's brought in money to the society. At the last count, India had about 3.4 million NGOs. Which is roughly one NGO for every 400 citizens in this country. So we have a lot of NGOs trying to do a bunch of things. And most of them, the number of NGOs who will have an annual budget in excess of 10 crores can be counted in 3 or 4 people's hands. It's a very few organizations that have scaled up. So that resources, it's brought in a pool of resources. So this is the good part. The problem has been that anything that you want to do, and I think the point that Sachin made about authenticity cannot come from authority. Right? Therefore, by mandating that you should be good, you will never make it work. It's like it's me like trying to tell my daughter to do her homework all the time, me breathing down her neck. She's going to find a way of beating the system very, very quickly, and she'll figure out smart ways, and mostly she's smarter than me. Most people are smarter than government, so they will figure out things. So that's what we are seeing. So anything that's mandated has a challenge, and the first thought is, how can I be compliant without fulfilling the thing? I think what it started off initially was, I think, a great one, which is, for instance, one, we said that there's a need for you to invest money into social causes. and you can put in a percentage of profit that you need to do that. You do that, or if you don't do that, say I haven't done it and this is why I haven't done it. Then you're leaving it to the other stakeholders, including regulators, customers, investors, employees, suppliers, to come to their own conclusion about the corporate. So spend or explain was a great way. The moment you make it into a criminal offense, or if you don't spend it this way, you have to spend it the other way by contributing to either the PM relief fund or any of those, that's when this becomes a little dysfunctional.
No, that's great. Thank you. I mean, you've tried to, like I noticed you've tried to stick to the middle path and not gone too controversial there, which is, I was hoping it would not happen, but it did. So let me come back to Sachin. I think you made a few very interesting points about the interplay between ethics and organizations, and you talked about people like me, like the millennials, right? There was a Deloitte report out which talked about how millennials expect their companies to do more things, right? To do good, and as Chuck would, like as I mentioned earlier, Chuck keeps saying, do good and you will do well, right? So could you shed some light on it? Tell us a bit about your experience.
Yeah, so then, it's all very well to have these frameworks and to have clarity, but what do you do, right? That's $1 million question. And where does it stop and where does it start? So I think that what is really interesting to see is how people are reconciling this to say, so if these are valid frameworks and these are essential things to bring into the company culture, if not start off with them, the ethics, the purpose, the trust, what does it mean for us, how we function, and how do we innovate, right? And I think that what is really interesting, Nav, is like what this leads to. Like, for instance, I'll give you a very small example of this kind of lens, right? From the legal point of view, not from the point of view of supply chains and things. Because if you apply the same trust, ethics, and purpose lens to, say, logistics side of business, you get some different answers. Of course, it should begin by being applied to the overall core of the business, the strategy. But I'm saying even if you break it up, you get different answers. But if you apply it to law, I mean, look at, for instance, the ethics side. Like I'll answer this by even narrating examples of conversations with people. Very recently, someone says to me, says, look, our customers sign enormous loan contracts with us. They don't understand a twat. They don't understand anything. We know that. Can't we make that understandable? Now, that innovation of making what you do understandable and passing that to the public domain, it comes from this, the framework, deeply embodying the framework, not just carrying it forward. So what would happen? So you can't set it up artificially saying social change, some NGO will do that. That you can do, and that will have downstream implications that are huge for everybody. That will increase literacy. Take another example, the example of contracts. Saying, look, we execute contracts with vendors and stuff. They have no way of knowing, are they executing a fair contract? What are their risks? We could automate this, make it smarter, make sure that, and then we could pass that into the public domain so that anyone, anywhere can understand if they're executing a fair or unfair contract. Take a third example. Take on the trust side, dispute resolution. Let's resolve our disputes differently. Let's shore up trust in our ecosystems, not litigation for everything that results in adverse deficit of trust. Let's recognize that many of these people we look at adversarially may come back as customers, may come back as vendors. What does that mean for us? We are forced to reimagine how we resolve our disputes. I can go on. The point I'm trying to make is that there are various avenues and pathways for how to conduct yourself when you come at yourself with these frameworks. It is not an artificial divide. That's why I understand the frustration of people like Anand Giridhar Das. He wrote Winners Take All. You should read the book. It's a very critical book on American capitalism, especially the capitalism that says we should do X and then we will make lots of money and save it and put it back, because the damage you've done insofar as trust and ethics, and you can't undo that damage. That's already a part of society. So I think that what I'm saying is not abstract. I'm saying that there are ways to act from this that actually are net positive for the organization. And the last thing I'll say, Nav, is that, and this is again controversial thing, but I feel that we are now at the point in our leadership ecosystem where, 20 years back, there was only maybe a couple of law schools that were of kind of a global standard. Maybe there was Campus Law Center, maybe a couple of others, right? But then the Mother Menon created the national law schools. Today, more and more of those people are coming into the leadership. That's got to count for something. That has to bring a certain set of values that you were taught, to come. And that latent leadership, to me, should not fit in too easily with the prevailing models. It should be pretty dynamic. It should push the envelope on these frameworks.
No, that's great. I mean, it reminds me of many conversations that we have had, right, in the past about what does it mean to be a good citizen, right? Not just a corporate citizen, but I think that's great. I think I will turn it a bit, and I'll come to you first, Lakshika, then I'll go to Lan. But the same question to a certain extent, right? I mean, there is this change now. We are saying, we want we want our employers to do the right thing, but is there a risk here, right? And I'll try to give a somewhat sanitized personal example here. Many products have encryption in them, right? And you often are asked by governments to give a copy so that they can, legal intercept. They can listen in and they can figure out if, bad people are doing things in their country. The question that I often used to ask myself is, and I think it comes down to the concept of ethics being somewhat of a personal thing as well, right? And you ask yourself, should I be selling this product to a government in a country which I don't trust, right? So say a government, let's take North Korea. That's probably the easiest example to use, right? Would you be willing to sell encryption equipment to North Korea? And I think the question that comes up is, am I deciding on this because I am politically of a certain view, right? Or is this really for me to decide? Because my job, after all, is to take care of my employees, my suppliers and my customers, right? So are we running a risk here, Lakshika, in terms of putting too many expectations on corporations?
So that's a great question, Navneet. I think it's not a question that is as narrowly answered as saying whether it impacts my organization or my employees. Things such as these have very long-term and cascading effects. And these when I say cascading effects, it's no longer about just the company or the employees, but it's also probably about the entire, say, business stream, the line of business, and then also about the nation or the country, so to say, right? So this links to many other issues. It's not then only about being a good corporate citizen, but it's also about being a good citizen. What is your national policy on such and such thing, and so on and so forth. So I think it links to a bigger dynamics, and then from that national debate, it then sort of transcends to what are and which are those international treaties you're a party to, and so on and so forth. So who decides then, that a certain bunch of countries that are part of NATO are the ones who are taking the calls, or the other ones who are left out, and so on and so forth. And they have their own socio-economical, political reasons for being part of these groups at an international level itself. So I think the way to then probably sort of navigate one's way through a situation like this is you need to break down in this question into slices. So you would first look up the laws that govern such things, and then beyond laws, you would then look at the regulations, or if the specific regulator in a jurisdiction is talking about these things, because the regulations are mostly based on fundamentally the concepts around ethics, trust. You mentioned encryptions, you're talking about export controls. These are basically regulations around trust. A bunch of nations come together, they're trusting each other to be, honest with themselves when, they are exporting or importing certain encryptions and so on and so forth. And the purpose, this is linked to a bigger purpose, because they want a certain thing not to be proliferated, a certain kind of thing which may be hazardous to public at large, or could damage and be disastrous to, say, humanity at large, is what they want to limit. I mean, you know, and then of course there is always a dissenting opinion also on this, but largely that is how then from regulations you would want to come down to the next slice, which is what is your company's purpose and what is your company value around it. So is the company's value to just make profits come what may at any cost, or is it linked to something else? Is the purpose something else, and hence the values are differently defined? And then of course, you know, to a person, the last slice would be the person or the leader who's actually assessing the situation, and it's incumbent upon that leadership to then always at all times keep these slices in focus and then take call on these kind of things. So it's slightly more complicated than just giving a yes or no answer, because sort of each of these slices very carefully to then decide, well, which side you are. Are you bordering, you know, on the fence? Are you sort of doing something which ethically may be right for the company, but not so much for the nation at large, or so on and so forth, or the group of people you're a part of, or you represent as a community, as a society, and so on. So it's not really a straight answer in that sense. But yes, of course, if you talk strictly in terms of, you know, legal sort of domain, or at an individual level, these are the slices that one would view and one would want to sort of work within. These are the parameters which are pretty well defined in that sense. And in case you find that even after having reviewed each of these slices, or going through all of them, you sort of make, or you find yourself making a decision you're not comfortable with, then you need to question if you're at the right place at the right time, or do you really want to be there?
I think that's right. I think you try to combine the two, right? You try to look at your organization's values and yours, and I think something that probably when we started our careers, we didn't have that that luxury, right? But let me come to you, Lan. You know, a lot of noise out there sometimes, right? And some of it is just publicity related. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal about HP and Intel supporting the surveillance networks in China, for example, right? So what's your view on that? I mean, is that fair criticism, or do you think it's a little more complicated, like Lakshika is saying?
Well, I think it is very complicated. You know, and a company has to operate on a dynamic basis, and so the way I like to think about it is that there are four things that you sort of often juggle with, and I'll start with what I call values. The values that company stands for, the values in society, they tend to be extremely core and long lasting. And that's, oh, by the way, they're also very society specific. So each country, each society has its own preference for certain values, and that's the longest. Then you have a filter of law, right? So that there are laws that thing, and laws have a life which is shorter than the values, but longer than anything else. So maybe values stay for a few hundred years, laws for closer to a few decades to maybe a century or so. And then you've got to sort of have, that's the next thing to look at. The third thing is what I call the norm. Norms in societies keep evolving, and while values stay for a very long time, laws for a long time, norms are relatively short. And my favorite example of that is how norms change. Is at the time when I started my career, I couldn't go into the office wearing a tattoo. I wouldn't be allowed inside. Now, I guess you would not be allowed if you didn't have one, if you kind of stuff, right? So there are stuff like that people accept. Our own attitude towards LGBT community, these are norms in society that change over shorter time frames. And finally, your fashions. Fashions are stuff that have lifespans ranging from few hours of trending in Twitter to a few days on newspapers or magazines kind of a stuff. So when companies have to make decisions on their business, it's very important that they stay true to the values. They're definitely compliant. They take care of the norms, but they can't be open to the noises that come from the short-term fashions. So I think if one thinks of it that way, it sounds a lot more neater in a framework. It's a lot more messier to execute. But I think that's the way one can sort of think about it. And I think that's the way most companies actually operate. That's the way I think about it, at least.
No, that's great. I think it's a nice way to try and break up the problem, right? Try to see where do you fall. And I think the challenge many times, I think, in a situation like ours is there are competing ethical issues, right? So I always compare an example to how you communicate, right? I spent some time working in the UK, and I think at times I've picked up a bad ability to communicate very indirectly, right? So I would, instead of saying, can you please get this done, I would say, if I were you, I would do this, so let me know, right? And I did this with a colleague of mine in Korea, and I said that, and luckily he responded to me, because so when I said, if I were you, I would do this, he responded saying, thanks, I'll wait for you to come back to me, right? So then I had to go back and say, no, what I'm saying is, you will do this, right? So it's a much more direct communication culture there, which sometimes gets lost in translation. But that was great. But that's a good way to look at it in a sense, right? I mean, you tend to have different perspectives. I see we have one question, and Benita would like to know, what are the panelists' thoughts on pro bono work and how they see their legal teams getting involved in the social change, right? So, Lakshika, shall I push that to you, and your thoughts on pro bono and how you feel your team is taking part in this whole exercise?
Sure. Okay. So, my non-political thoughts on it first. Well, you're hardly left with any time for anything beyond work, and that also spills over your weekends, your family time, and this and that and everything. And in fact, now we no longer talk about work-life balance. We talk of work-life integration. So should I keep pro bono into my family time, or should I look at pro bono as a part of my work? Should I look, okay, so now coming to a more serious way to handle it, and honestly, the way I handle it is, so I consider it a part of my work. And when I say work, it's not a burden on me. I love to do what I do. And, work is sort of passion for me. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I think I look at it as integrated into the work. Pro bono is I don't know why we always talk of it as a separate head or a separate category or something, but we should look at it more as integrated into what we do, because there are so many learnings that you pick up there, which is so relevant for what you do in your day-to-day, not just professional, but personal life. And I mean, that's my personal experience, and that's what I'm sharing right now. So for me, pro bono is not something removed from what I would do. Perhaps all my work, I would like to, keep a channel open in whatever I do and whenever I do. If there is scope to do something more, even if it's pro bono, I would sort of jump at it and see how I can accommodate that into the schedule.
That's thank you very much, Lakshika. I think, Sachin, do you have any thoughts from the time you were a lawyer?
It was so far back and so small that I really don't have much to add.
Okay. So, and I think, Lan, feel free to jump in if you have any thoughts, right? But I think, from my perspective, the way you look at it is, so first a rant, right? The reality is, in India, the in-house departments are supposed to suspend their bar council certifications, right? So licenses. So as a result, we are not lawyers. So technically we can't do pro bono work. But that said, I think we do, I at least look at it two ways. One is we try to do things together as a team, right? So we encourage people to, you can go spend some time at a legal services clinic, for example, and give some advice or help people around. The second thing we try to do, and we haven't done that in India so much, but at least in the more bigger countries otherwise, what we do is we give weightage to it when we are empaneling lawyers, right? So law firms. So you would say that, okay, if you've done X number of, if this is your policy, I think that's a critical thing. I do see that in many cases, entry into various, and this is more for the law firms than anybody else, you see many of the, and by the way, many of the award ceremonies are all, bunkum, but the ones that do try to form some kind of logical way of doing it, they do look at that as well, right? So I think it's important to do it, but to Lakshika's point, I think, the concept of pro bono is kind of getting mixed up with work at times, right? And you could be doing both at the same time as well. So I think hopefully everybody works on the same, pulls to the same direction, and I think social change happens, right? It's not just limited to this is my free time or not. I see one more question here, and I think we are running short on time, but if everybody's okay, I would like to ask this question. That can be the last one, and then we can go into the wrap up. If that's
Nav, can I just add to that?
Sure, please, yeah.
Which is, Benita asked the question. I think Benita is the Benita who is a part of iPro Bono, which is doing remarkable work on basically spreading pro bono culture. And I think it's absolutely critical, as long as it doesn't become the CSR of lawyers. What I mean by that is it doesn't become, again, an excuse not to integrate real leadership and innovation in how the businesses. It shouldn't be. I have done my work on that toxic gas somewhere, and now I'm going to do my pro bono. So, I'm just saying, it's so important that it doesn't let us off the hook of reimagining our full leadership. But of course, it is an essential part of being a full citizen. So, not to take anything away. That's my viewpoint.
I think that's right. I think it's the law of unintended consequences sometimes applies, right? So I think that's what we want to try and avoid. So the second question that we have here, and that'll be in the last one for today, is, hi, there has been a lot of discussion on the issue of the leadership by general counsels. However, I would like to know what is the advice that the panelists have on the actions that a junior legal counsel should take to add value to the GC's leadership on the issue of social responsibilities, right? So if you were a junior lawyer in a situation, I think, Lakshika, what advice would you give yourself?
I think because this question, it's a good question, and I think there's a very straight answer to it. Being a GC, you're hardly left with any time for doing anything beyond sort of your day-to-day routine, and there is so much that happens which is out of the book all the time, that you're sort of either mitigating risk or looking at solutions here and there, giving opinions. So you don't have enough time with you. For a person in the team, who is keen to know what and how they could contribute, I think execution, if they could take some load off execution, that will be really helpful, because you may have a great thought and you may start off a project with a lot of enthusiasm at times, but I've seen that even after you've sort of triggered it, if you're not able to follow through well on it, or you're not able to devote enough time, it sort of fizzles down at times, and that becomes extremely painful. So I think that is something where a person in the team could contribute to. Just pick up from where the GC left the thread and sort of contribute and see if they can help with the executions.
Yeah, Lan, from your perspective, may not be legal counsel, but as a group.
So very often when I meet corporate, when I talk to corporates and meet young executives, they ask me, when do we start thinking about our social responsibilities, about social problems? Is it after we sort of have reached a particular stage in career or comfort or whatever? And my response is that's very similar to the way we think about our health, right? I think when I grew up, nobody bothered about exercising till they got their first heart attack. Now kids do that very early. I'm just saying that we should reach a sensibility where we should start thinking about our social and civic muscle the same way we think about our physical muscles, right? We start early, just getting sensitized to the fact. And Navneet, just indulge me for 30 seconds as I reel out some statistics. Around the time that we all went to school, out of 100 children who could go to school, only about 80 children went to school. Of the 100 who went to school, about 40 reached 10th grade. Of the 100 who reached 10th grade, 35 cleared 10th. Of the 100 who cleared 10th, only 20 went on to do undergrad. Everyone in this thing would know where they are if you do the math or which percentage of the population we are in. And that's true for most executives in India. The numbers have changed, they've improved, but not drastically in India. So we have all got this thing, and therefore it's important that we just build that social civic muscle into us as early as possible. So a long answer, but my advice would be as early as possible, start getting that sensitivity.
No, I think that just brings it home, doesn't it? the level and the extent of the problem, right? I think many of us live in bubbles, really, and I think seeing this and hearing it land. Thank you for bringing that up. I think the issue is as much about leadership as it's about CSR, right? So my personal view would be, and somebody much more intelligent than me gave me this advice many years ago. They said, always lead before the org structure gives you the opportunity to do so, right? So if you're already behaving as a senior person, right, be rest assured, and provided the organization is run in a normal way, right, be rest assured that you will be chosen to become that leader, right? And I think that's always good advice that I try to follow, right? So you are always trying to do things as a lawyer, as a junior, whether it doesn't matter, junior lawyer, senior lawyer, doesn't really matter. Try to do things as a person who is not just limited to your role, your grade, or your function, right? You give advice on everything. And sometimes you'll make a fool of yourself because you'll open your mouth about things that you don't know anything about. That's fine, right? Nobody's going to, at least in most cases, nobody's going to tell you that you are actually a fool, right? So be out there, be a little, show a little, excitement and knowledge, and if social issues are ones that are important to you, right? I mean, like Lakshika said, pick up the ball from where the GC left it. Encourage the team to go out and do something together. There are so many things out there in this country, and I think that's one of the things that's exciting about India is the fact that we can, by doing so little, we can actually make such a big difference, right? And I think that's probably where we all want to get to. But we are out of time today. So I did want to say a quick thank you to Lakshika, Sachin, and thank you for coming. I think the points you made were fantastically relevant for us. I think the concept of trust and how do we encourage our organizations to do the right thing. And ultimately, I think we can all say, by doing good, you will do well. And I think it's kind of interesting, actually. The person who actually first said this concept was the CEO of BlackRock, who said, if you don't do good, you won't do well, right? And they said, and therefore they said, we're going to change our investment plans, we're going to move to sustainable part of the economy, etc. And he got a lot of flack, right? Because people said, that's not your job, right? Your job is to invest properly so I can make some money, not for you to go and talk about being good or whatever, right? You could also argue at times that by companies putting in money, like you mentioned, Sachin, that that's not what we give you the money for, right? I mean, you're supposed to be investing it back into your business. But those are all different aspects of a very complicated situation that we always have to balance, right? But I think it's important we have that conversation, and I think it's important that we try to do what we can in the limited space we have. Right? So thank you very much again for a patient hearing, and thank you to the panelists for giving us their Friday evening. I hope you guys stay safe and keep well, and see you soon. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Navneet.
Thank you. Thank you.